So thank you so much for accepting me. I'm a PhD student. Oops. In Hungary at the University of Miskolc and working in the Hungarian National Museum. And I would like to present the first results of my PhD program about two Bronze Age cemeteries. And yes, the analyzed sites are located on the northern fringes of the Great Hungarian Plain at the southern territory of the modern town of Maklar. Two cremation Bronze Age cemeteries are known in this region, 1.5 kilometers from each other, namely Maklar Nagyrét 2, marked by yellow, and Maklar Kospérium, marked by orange on this map. Both sites can be dated by relative chronology around the 15th to 1300 BC to the period of the tumulus culture. Recently ongoing field surveys indicating that the cemeteries can belong to one settlement marked by blue on this map. Therefore, there are at least two distinct, well-known burial grounds of this Bronze Age community. On Maklar Nagyrét 2, 210 burials were found, including 112 urns, 95 scattered cremations, and 3 without human remains. Here, the western and northeastern part of the burial ground were excavated, and the dense part of it probably lay between the two main excavation areas, and its eastern border is still unknown. On Maklar Kospérium, a huge area of the central part was destroyed by mining activities. Regardless, 121 burials were found, including 80 urns, 28 scattered cremations, and 13 without human remains. Despite the sporadic excavation areas of this site, 4 grave groups can be identified. In both cemeteries, the urn graves consisted of the most vessels, generally an urn for the human remains, covered usually by a bowl, and sometimes cups, pots, and bowls were placed also in the grave, probably with food or liquid grave goods. However, a few scattered cremation graves also included pots, cups, or bowls, but generally less. In my research, I was interested in the following questions. How different and/or similar are the vessels and raw materials between the two distinct cemeteries at Maklar? Are there any evidence for specialized pottery production? Are there any specific vessel types that can be connected to a particular burial rite or identity in the cemeteries? And finally, are there any correlation between the raw materials and tempering of different vessel types between the analyzed sites? For the analysis, thin section petrography was applied along with polarization microscopy. The sampling was difficult on the Maklar Kospérium assemblage because most of the pottery finds were glued together and complemented by clay after the excavation in the 1960s. For this reason, most of the vessels were not adequate for thin section petrography, although 30 thin sections were made. Sampling was easier in the Maklar Nagyrét 2 ceramic assemblage since it was possible to select before the restorations were begun. Therefore, 54 thin sections were made, and it was possible to investigate ceramic assemblages from specific burials. Regarding the typological analysis of the Maklar cemeteries, the same types were used in both sites, excluding only a few unique categories. Within the urns, I would like to highlight the type that is appearing only in the Kospérium assemblage, and it is a completely common pot type in the domestic sphere during this period. The bowls were mostly used to cover the urns, and only a few were placed on the pyre during and then into the grave. Most of the bowls can be assigned to only one typological category. Regarding small amphoras, 4 and 3 shapes can be distinguished, and almost each of these types were placed on the pyre during the cremation process. Therefore, I will talk about them in detail later. Finally, 3 and 6 categories were classified within the cuts, from which a lot were also heavily secondary burned. Generally, the uniformity of vessel types and the appearance of ornaments suggesting homogeneity in pottery style that might indicate the cemeteries were used for maybe only a few generations, and based on typology and burial rites, the cemeteries can be contemporary. Based on non-plastic inclusions, 7 major fabric groups were identified in the Maklar Nagyrét 2 cemetery and further subgroups within them. Generally, the raw materials are likely local, homogeneous, and very similar. Most of the fabric consists of very fine and fine-grained sandy raw material, and the types of non-plastic inclusions in different fabric groups are similar, while while 36 samples were tempered by grog. 3 fabrics contains 1 to 3 millimeter size local volcanic rock fragments in larger quantity that usually can be easily identified by macroscopic observations because these fragments are visible on the vessel surface. In the Cosperium assemblage, 5 major fabric groups were identified with further subgroups. The raw materials are very similar to Noduate-2 cemetery and can also be local, contains mostly very fine and fine-grained sandy raw material. The types of non-plastic inclusions in the different fabric groups are similar, and 10 samples were tempered by grog. It's important to talk about the grog tempering because its appearance only depends on the maker's choice. Therefore, it can be an important marker of pottery making tradition. As I mentioned, only 10 samples contain grog in the Cosperium cemetery, that is 33% of them. Controversially, 36 samples were tempered by grog in the Noduate-2 cemetery, which is 66% of the analyzed samples, which is a significant difference between the sites pottery making traditions. It can be said that mostly the well and moderately well sorted fabrics contain grog, but no other pattern was detected yet. In both sites, the texture of grogs was similar to the vessel that was tempered, which might indicate that the producer has reused his own broken fragments. And finally, in one case, a grog in a grog was identified in one sample. In the Cosperium assemblage, 20 specimens It is important to talk about in detail about the small amphoras recovered from the cemeteries. In the Noduate-2 assemblage, 17 specimens were found that can be classified into 4 major categories. Interestingly, each specimen was found in red or brown color with gray dots, and some of them are deformed and have heavy burn traces on its surface and in its structure. These observations can suggest that these vessels were placed on the pyre during the cremation process of the deceased. Anthropological analysis determined the biological sex and age of death in 5 cases, each of them as adult women, and only age of death as 5 children and 4 young adults. However, grave goods such as bronze ornaments, glass, and clay beads indicate female identity to these individuals buried with small amphoras despite the missing anthropological determination. In the Cosperium assemblage, 20 specimens were found that can be assigned to 3 major categories, including 2 miniature examples. In this assemblage, 14 amphoras were found with heavy secondary burning traces or slightly deformation, indicating these were also placed on the pyre during the cremation. Anthropological analysis was not yet carried out on this site, but grave goods such as bronze ornaments and clay beads indicating female or children identity most of these individuals. Regarding the spatial distribution of small amphoras in the cemeteries, there are no obvious patterns in their appearance, not considering specific types. They occur in every part and each burial group in both cemeteries. However, its quantity is twice as much in the Cosperium, and excluding one type, each shape appearing in both sites. In order to investigate the raw materials, 9 scene sections were made altogether, 8 from the Noduate-2 and 1 from the Cosperium. It is important to keep in mind that the heavy secondary burning could have modified the raw materials. All in all, it can be said that these vessels were made of very similar, possibly local sandy raw material, but slightly different. These were observed in the quantity and size of non-plastic inclusions, and 3 samples were tempered by grog. Therefore, 3 fabric groups have been identified. It is possible that the raw material naturally shows dimensions, even size ranges of non-plastic inclusions, but it is also possible that larger inclusions were removed during material preparations, such as levitation or seeding. There seems to be no clear relationship between vessel types and raw materials. To summarize raw material choice in the analyzed sites, more fabric groups were identified in the Noduate-2 cemetery, although this can be caused by the not ideal sampling possibilities on the Cosperium assemblage. Moreover, similar raw materials were used specifically in the Noduate-2 cemetery, and the ongoing investigation of local clay sources would provide further detailed information. The raw material choice seems to be unintentional, but the urn and the bowl of grave 90 were made of the same raw material. However, this is the only exception. Generally, there is no correlation, such as in the case of grave 49, where 4 different raw materials were used for 4 different vessels. In conclusion, the analyzed tumulus culture burial grounds at Maklar can be the cemeteries of the same community who designated 2 different burial grounds. Regarding pottery production, there is no evidence for specialization, and the volcanic rock fragments in the local sediment and in the raw materials suggest the application of local clay sources. There seems to be no obvious relationship between vessel types and raw materials, but it can be said that thinner walled vessels, like cups, pots, or bowls, were mostly made of well-sorted raw materials, while thicker walled specimens like urns were made of coarser fabrics with bigger grain size. In some cases, however, well-decorated urns were made of well-sorted fabrics as well. It can be possible that the well-sorted raw materials naturally show the equal even size ranges of non-plastic inclusions, but it is also possible that larger inclusions were removed during material preparation. Furthermore, there is a significant difference between the size, since the grob tempering is twice as common in the Nagyvai II ceramic assemblage than in the Hospirium. This can indicate different pottery making traditions between the cemeteries, despite the fact that the same vessel types appear, excluding a few specimens in both sites. The small amphoras from the sites indicate that they can be mostly linked to women and children. These can also be connected to a specific burial rite, since most of them were heavily burnt or deformed, suggesting that these specimens were placed on the fire during the cremation process, probably containing special liquid that might be related to women or children's identity. And thank you so much.
You were on time. Thank you. We have several minutes, so if anyone has some questions, wants to share some thoughts, you're welcome. No? Thank you very much. Thank you. Now I would like to invite our next speaker, Esther Solnay, technical traditions and social indebtedness of pottery production in the early and middle Copper Age Eastern Hungary.
Okay. So, good afternoon. I'm Esther Solnay. I'm a doctoral student in Eötvös Loránd University and Université Perián Pantheon Sorbonne, and I would like to present my research, technical traditions and social embeddedness of the pottery production in the early and middle Copper Age Eastern Hungary. After the late Neolithic, many aspects of the life gradually transformed in the early Copper Age on the Great Hungarian Plain. The fells and large horizontal settlements were replaced by a network of generally small settlements. The first formal cemeteries were established, and the first heavy copper object appeared. Many of these transformations continued into the Middle Copper Age, but among other things, the large-scale settlements frequently established, the formal cemeteries were abandoned, and the local metallurgy appeared. Previously, 3 sharply separated archaeological cultures were defined in the region in strict chronological succession, the Tiszapolgár, Bodrogkeresztúr, and Hunyadi-Halom cultures. This concept was mainly established by the pottery styles of the cemeteries and the few settlements. However, in recent years, new chronological and intensive settlement studies have challenged these traditional models. They clearly demonstrate that these cultures cannot be described as different, well-defined homogeneous entities, and that there is no sufficient explanation for the variability or homogeneity of their ceramic styles. Furthermore, it has also become clear that such cultural models are not suitable for identifying the social networks built from personal contacts and for mapping the knowledge that is transmitted through them. To understand these, a completely new methodological approach was needed that is different from the previously used typological methods of the pottery analysis. I would like to explore these technological and social aspects of the prehistoric communities with the technological analysis of pottery forming. One of the main advantages of this methodology is its capability to define real embedded knowledge and social patterns by a detailed analysis of the individual vessels. This method is based on the anthropological approach of techniques that describes the strong relation between the steps of production process and the social identity of the producer. In the case of ceramic vessels, this relation can be found between the vessel fabrication steps and the social links of the pottery maker. The reason for this lies in the learning process because the necessary motoric and cognitive skills of forming are acquired during long learning. This process requires intensive personal interaction between the learner and the tutor, during which the learner observes and copies the way of doing of the tutors, such as the tools and gestures. Once the process is completed, the learned motoric and cognitive skills became fixed and difficult to change later. The learning process always takes place in social groups, also known as communities of practices, that are connected by common technological knowledge. Thus, I was able to identify the network of personal interaction of pottery makers through the observation of pottery forming techniques. I carried out macroscopical analysis on the inner and outer surface of the vessels, the wall thickness, the lines of fractures, and the internal structure of the vessel walls to identify forming traces that are visible to naked eyes. These allow us to define different forming techniques that were interpreted with the aid of ethnographic, archaeological, and experimental reference work. Therefore, I reconstructed different forming methods, namely the order sequences of the forming techniques. I analyzed 725 vessels from 8 early and middle Copper Age sites, settlements, cemeteries, and grave groups located in the Middle Tisa region and the northern Great Hungarian Plain. Using the traditional typological classification based on the pottery style, all of these sites can be defined as Tiszapolgár, Bodrogkeresztúr, and Hunyadi-Halom. In the Gökkábrány region, however, stylistic features typical of the Budapest region are also appeared. The most common forming method was to build up the body of the vessel with bottom-up coiling technique. When they were built, the vessel with coils of different sizes from the base towards the rim. However, the base could be shaped in different ways. The most common base was built from one or multiple superposed clay discs, but they can be formed with spirals or rings of coils, as well as one or multiple superposed clay discs around which an additional coil was attached. All of these can be identified in a wide range of ceramic forms, like barrel-shaped vessels, storage jars, or jugs. The next forming method is not radically different from the previous one, since the body of these vessels was formed with coiling technique, but the coils were attached with the aid of a support. Two very different types of coiling in on a support could be identified. The vessels were most frequently built with reverse coiling technique. This consists of attaching wide coils on an upturned support, starting with the rim towards the base. This technique was exclusively used to create wider balls with or without pedestals. The pedestals were always shaped with bottom-up coiling technique. Moreover, the rim was frequently formed from coils after removing the body from the support. However, the absence of presence of the rim cannot be linked to specific vessel forms, thus they can be considered different variants. Besides, another way of coiling in or support could also be found on a few vessels. This is the third one on the picture. In the case of the pottery maker, in this case, the pottery makers was formed one compact clay disc and placed it into a support. Then the body was created from coils, also in the same support. This technique was exclusively identified on tulip-shaped vessels. Molding was another very common forming method. In other words, the clay disc was pressed against a convex or concave mold to take its shape. Coils were then attached to the bodies of the vessels to form the ring. This was mainly used to create various types of balls. Modeling the vessel from one clay mass with pinching or drawing was also appeared. In some cases, elements from coils would be added to the form to form various vessel parts, such as the pedestals, necks, or rims. These were mainly used to create miniature vessels or smaller balls. And finally, slab technique was at least frequent when the vessels were made of slabs of different sizes and shapes on a mold. This was principally identified on balls or coarser wares.
I have explanation. There's explanation behind this. I'm really sorry. Social media is really important, so it has to be done right now. Sorry. Sorry.
Okay. So the results present a completely new and highly complex picture of the technological knowledge and social networks, which are very different from the traditional cultural boundaries. At this point of the research, it is highly unlikely that early and middle Copper Age pottery makers specialized in only one pottery form. Therefore, a common technological knowledge can be identified that was possibly known by all or almost all the pottery makers in the region, regardless of the ceramic style and the absolute dating of the specific sites where they lived. This knowledge was much more complex than previously expected because the pottery makers could use different forming methods according to the shape and size of the vessels. Although there have been only a few publications on the forming technology of prehistoric ceramic vessels in the Carpathian Basin, most of these ways of formings can be found in the Carpathian Basin since the Neolithic. This suggests a learning network with strong local origin that indicates long-term social continuity. However, in the early and middle Neolithic, pottery makers probably used single technique to make all the vessel forms, which perhaps began to change in the late Neolithic. Therefore, the process of knowledge of transfer was continuous, but transformed by the early Copper Age, when the pottery maker already possessed many of the methods that existed separately in the Neolithic. In addition, a minor difference can be observed in the common early and middle Copper Age pottery forming practices. Although the reverse coiling was part of the shared technological package, smaller coils were often added to shape the rim, regardless of the pottery form. The spatial distribution and the variation of this variation shows that these supplementary coils were only used at Polgar and the Middle Tisa region, but not at the Ducabra microregion. This minor difference may reflect the closer social ties between the pottery makers working in the different regions, resulting in local variations within a common tradition. Furthermore, a few identified forming methods were presumably not part of this shared technological knowledge. Most of them can be detected on pottery forms that were generally made with one of the common forming methods. Therefore, the pottery makers who made these vessels could learn these techniques through a different social network. They may still have known some elements of the common technological package, but some forms were certainly shaped differently. Some of these methods were known from the Carpathian Basin since the early Neolithic, such as the method where the base was built with one or multiple superposed clay discs. Thus, they might have been an older technical tradition, but they had not become part of the common knowledge. Only certain pottery makers could use and pass on it. While other methods were not yet identified in earlier periods, for example, the vessels were made with slab technique, although a part of them can be found in early and middle Copper Age settlements in the Budapest region. Some pottery makers may therefore have had extensive contact networks beyond the here analyzed Great Hungarian Plain. Besides these uncommon forming methods were occasionally used to shape new pottery forms, such as the tulip-shaped vessels that appeared only in the Middle Copper Age. In this case, it is possible that by adopting a new ceramic form, the pottery makers have also mastered a new forming method. This also implies contact network between the studied regions. It is very difficult to interpret this highly complex network of technological knowledge. The shared package of pottery forming indicates a strong continuity with the local Neolithic communities. In addition, the minor micro-regional variations could be the imprints of close links between pottery makers working in neighboring settlements. However, presumably other knowledge transfer networks with strong Neolithic roots may have been existed, which only a minority of the pottery makers belong. Besides, some communities may have had extensive contact networks with other regions, which could mean the mobility of the pottery makers or the vessels. Petrographic analysis of the vessels from individual sites will have to clarify this issue, but at this point of the research, we can expect maybe local pottery production. Thus, a high degree of mobility of certain pottery makers can be assumed in multiple settlements as opposed to other, possibly more close communities. Furthermore, the results not correspond with the spread of different ceramic styles. It is therefore essential to revise these traditional models of the period. And thank you for your attention.
This was really nice. I'm impressed because this is very, very important research. I think with forming techniques, and thank you very much for this. Does anyone have any questions, please? Someone from the college? Oh, please, Jan.
This high mobility, can it have something to do with the mobility of the conference site,
At this point, I don't know because it's my PhD thesis, so I continuing to analyze more and more sites. I almost finished all the basic, or I'm almost finished the database for my PhD. But at this point, I'm not sure. I think we need some other aspects of analysis, like strontium analysis or the eDNA or something like that to tell this, because only based on the pottery assembly. So we at this point we don't know the technology of the other objects like the stone tools or bones or something like that. So I think after the analysis of the other object types and supplementary data like strontium or something like that, after I think we can have something like. But at this point, I don't want to to define this.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else, please? No, thank you very much. Now I would like to invite our next speakers. We move forward chronologically. Cesare Rita and Josipa Mandic, pottery productions and their role in the social dynamics between indigenous and indigenous communities in the Iron Age Mediterranean. The case of the Incoronata of the Itaka South.
Good afternoon to you all. First of all, we want to really thank the organizers for accepting our paper and giving us the opportunity to present the last data from our ongoing studies on pottery from this beautiful site that is in Coronata, where we are working the last 10 years. We are really happy to be here and also honored. So let's introduce the site. Incoronata is situated on a low hill that flanks the Basenza River, only 7 kilometers away from the Ionian coast of the Basilicata region in southern Italy. And this site has been subject of systematic archaeological investigation since 1971. The first excavation started by the Regional Archaeological Superintendency, soon followed by those of the University of Milan, University of Texas, and in the last 20 years by those of Orange University. The long history of the investigation of this nutrient site has brought to light a large amount of archaeological evidence that not only attest to an indigenous presence during the 9th and 8th century BC, but also to the Greek-indigenous interactions that preceded the foundation of the Achaemenid colony of Metaponto on the Ionian coast through the context of the 7th century BC. So while the first readings of the context and materials of this site have principally been associated to its nature as an emporium or a settlement, the archaeological investigation of the last few decades permitted to add and to develop other interpretation in the light of some new discoveries of craft and ritual spaces. So the Greek and indigenous pottery finds, the object of this paper, have a major role in the study of the Greco-Notian intercommunity relations and cooperation developed in the craft environment during the 7th century BC. So the first traces of the occupation of the site are dated in the 9th and in the 8th century, as specified by a large number of contexts such as ritual pits, a triangular enclosure, pebble pavement, characterized by the presence of the indigenous Notian matte painted pottery, courseware, and also impasto pottery. Ola, jags, sicule, and the local provenience of all this pottery was confirmed by ceramic placers found mostly in the southern part of the site. On the other hand, the first important ceramic incoronata arrived from Corinth, date back to the first half of the 8th century, and are attested with sporadic but important pottery findings. In fact, since 1974 until today, only 5 fragments of Corinthian medium geometric tree pottery productions were found, and particularly fragments of protocotyli and lectite. These vessels represent the most ancient evidence of imported pottery found in an indigenous pre-colonial site in the hinterland of the Metaponto coast area. The end of the 8th century and the beginning of the 7th century BC is a period during which the context with the mixed Greco-indigenous material culture began to prevail. This period is marked by the reappearance of the imports from Corinth that will have a great impact on the local ceramic production at Incoronata. Among the most ancient Proto-Corinthian imports of closed shapes, there are Aribaloi lectitoi. Among the open shapes, we have cotyli and cups. And lastly, also oinokoi with triple lip and ovoid body derived also for more globular types of late geometric period. So starting from the second quarter of the 7th century, the majority of the local production of the subgeometric and glazed fine ware gather both the vessels that replicate or readapt to the most common pottery types and decoration derived from different region traditions. This is visible in the craters and stammer, with decorative patterns that were initially assimilated mainly to the archive repertory, but the most recent analysis proposed a new interpretation that sees in Incoronata an original multilingual style which mixes the Proto-Corinthian, Proto-African, Cycladic, and Eastern Greek motifs. Other common shapes of the local production of the pottery are cantaroid and cantaroid vases, mostly represented by kiln type. These are in fact comparable with the cantaroid found in northwest Achaia and West Greek sites like Ithaca and Patras. So all these data, merged with those of the context of discovery of this pottery, provide us a further insight of the different ways the pottery was consumed and relieve a more nuanced outlook of the indigenous interactions at Incoronata during the 7th century. These traces, the traces of these interactions are visible from numbers archaeological records and can be resumed in the following context related to the craft discharge, lethal deposits, and pits. The first context related to the craft activity of the field was found in an area where the most ancient bases of Notian fermentation were brought to light. Among the most important excavated structures, there is a ritual pit and a new triangular enclosure mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So both contexts are characterized by the exclusive presence of indigenous pottery and are dated at 9th and 8th century BC. Nearby, we found also 2 paved terraces, and the most recent one, number 38, was obliterated at the second half of the 7th century by a ceramic discharge of basers, both of indigenous and Greek type pottery, mixed with film fragments and ashes. Among the Greek vessels, it was possible to distinguish always cups, spikoi, kateriskoi, oinokoi, tigriai, and among the indigenous ones, all jars, jugs, matte painted ware, courseware, and bustware. The analysis of this context and of the craft area underline their importance as evidence of the shared spaces used by indigenous and Aegean artisans for the ceramic production at Ticonata during the 7th century. The first achromatic analysis of the shards found in the context associated to the craft area relieved the two distinguishable local production techniques that implied different clay preparation for the Notrian and Greek painted fineware. Different recipes imply different knowledge that could have been shared in the framework of this melting pot of artisans communities at Coronata. The sharing of ideas is also reflected in the interplay of the decorative patterns and vessel shapes of the two traditions. This is illustrated by the potter's experiments, vessels that morphologically seems to derive from Greek type, such as the spikos, but that was produced and decorated with Enotrian matte painted pottery techniques. An example of adoption of allogenous motifs on Enotrian pottery is represented also by a fragment of matte painted ola or jag with a motif of a sacred tree and a meander hook that belongs to the Greek geometric repertory and that we find also on the famous Nestor's cup from Ischia. Another more recent find is a jar with recalls shapes of indigenous pottery, but the production technique and paint are instead typical of Greek repertory. So the combination of the decoration motifs is also eclectic. The ray motif placed in the internal part of the ring recalls the matte painted pottery patterns. Motifs on the neck and the lower part of the body could derive from the Corinthian geometric or proto-Corinthian motif, and those at the central part of the body are closer to those of the insular and Eastern Greek origin. The ceramic discharged wasters and the specimen of hidden pottery that cross allogenous and local craft techniques leave us the idea of an active cooperation between Notrian and Aegean artisans at Coronata. Nevertheless, other contexts testify that the interaction of these two communities went long beyond the joint craft activities. So this is the case of another deposit, number 4, found in the final levels of this axial building and datable at the end of the 7th century. The peculiarity of this context is that the deposited Greek and Notrian vessels belong to the most representative shapes linked to the wine consumption of both respective communities. So while the Greek counterpart is represented by locally produced crater that typologically takes inspiration from the shapes of more ancient Corinthian model, the indigenous one is denoted through the two askoi, indigenous wine containers, datable within the 3rd quarter of the 7th century. Moreover, the fact that all the pottery of the deposit was intentionally fragmented or cut out and deposited in the layers with evidence of activity, of fire activity, because we found chortles, suggests that the ceremonial use of the consumption of these vessels. The nature of the context that reflects shared ritual practice between Notrian and Aegean communities at the end of the 7th century was confirmed also by the nearby discovery of the cut-out foot of an SOS amphora found vertically fixed in the ground for validation purposes. Apart from the ceramic deposits, other relevant examples of ritual interaction can be detected in the pebble marked spaces with pits. This is the case of a recently excavated pit still under study, discovered under a mound of pebbles, which remains of ceremonial meals and libation ceramics both of indigenous and Greek tradition. The top of the pit was sealed with compact layer built with mixture of stone flakes, broken pebbles. Its filling consisted of a progressive series of layers with returned fragments of concocto, locally produced ceramics, 2 spindle whorls, and 1 faience bead found at the bottom of the pit. While the vessels produced with indigenous techniques consisted of containers or reduced to miniaturistic pottery, all the drinking vessel was inspired from Peloponnesian pottery production. To conclude, from the 7th century BC, the presence of the allogenous communities is reflected in the change of craft dynamics through the introduction of variety in local subgeometric and painted fineware production, that from this moment and until the end of the 7th century opens the ceramic shapes and decoration derived from Peloponnesian Cycladic Isolite pottery. Nonetheless, this can also be detected through hybrid pottery production, which is the result of durable interplay and shared know-how between local and foreign artisans that work together at Imperonata, and which attest their creative, artistic, and craft expression. The melting pot of artistic and craft cultures and skills at Imperonata reached the highest point at the second half of the 7th century in the local production of the figure pottery, which is characterized by an original multilingual style developed by the Aegean painters active at the site. Finally, the consumption of the pottery can provide us more complex picture of the Greek indigenous intercommunity relation at Imperonata and relieve also not only the sharing of craft, but also the element of shared rituals. What emerged from the analysis of the second half century phase is that even in the ritual context, the ceramic material culture use is always mixed. In that framework, the fineware shapes of both traditions are always related to drinking and pouring vessels or containers for liquid used for libation ceremonies, and were often associated also with consumption of ritual meals. Furthermore, they can be found deposited with other items such as weaving tools, fragmental metal objects, and miniaturized pottery. It is also interesting to observe that certain indigenous shapes typical of the 8th century continue to be produced during the 7th century, but with different craft techniques. This is the case of the impastaware, and more precisely with the situla containers used as markers of ritual spaces like deposits or graves, as well as funeral vessels of Antiquismos burial ritual that was attested for the first time last year in Imperonata. The stratigraphic and object analysis are gradually bringing out more and more clearly the ceremonial aspect and ritual nature of certain contexts. And these analyses and future archaeological investigation will help us trace all the different shades of interaction where the pottery takes center stage, which occurred between the Oenotrians and first Aegean travelers that reached Imperonata at the dawn of the foundation of the colony of Metaponto. So finally, they will also bring us a richer insight of the 7th century BC, a period characterized by social cultural transformation arisen with the arrival of allogenous communities, but during which the indigenous one continued to play the pivotal role in the management of the site. So thank you for your attention.
I love this hybrid feature.
Yeah,
For me, this is really very, very exciting. Does anyone have any questions, please? If I may.
Yes.
I mean,
Of course.
there is of course lots of things that we can discuss. But you said these hybrid features,
Yes.
you interpret them as kind of sharing knowledge,
Yes.
or be more specific. I know it's a
Sharing
very
knowledge.
difficult question.
Yes,
I know that, but
it's difficult to prove it.
Yes, of
We
course.
are talking always about hypotheses.
Yeah.
Sharing knowledge, we are talking about sharing knowledge. We know that there was a circulation of Aegean people that arrived before the colonization of the territory of South Italy. So they arrived, they did their job. So if they were artisans, they made pottery and they traveled. So we have some proofs, but more in the second half of the 7th century with the figure ceramic that we have artisans that traveled around South Italy, also in Sicily, and that produced the same kind of ceramic. Yes, and so we have the circulation of certain types of ceramic. There are a lot of analysis of iconographics analysis. We did also some archaeometric analysis. We are at the beginning of this phase of the things that we notice in the first results, that there are some differences in the production of the fineware that was of indigenous tradition and Greek type. pottery. We said Greek type because it is locally produced, but it represents a Greek type pottery. It's not indigenous one. So there are some differences in firing, in the inclusions that they use, the type of the preparation of the clay. So we find also the criteria that prove the existence of this space that was shared, because the ways that we find, they were found together. So we find, all our, we made painted pottery together with the skin foil and the tons of Greek type. So we know that they produce two types of pottery, and the archaeometric analysis show us that they reproduce also the different techniques. So we knowing that there were potters that were circulating in South Italy before the colonization of this territory, we can imagine that effectively there were two communities, the one indigenous that welcomed the Greek one, and that they produced together in the same place, the existing place of craft area, because the craft area existed in the 8th century and produced only indigenous kind. In the 7th, they produced both kinds. Yeah. So this is this is the first data that we have till now.
This is good to hear, because we have this kind of hybridization from Neolithic onwards.
Yeah. Yes.
So it's I think it's important to emphasize those processes, because they are triggered with different factors.
Yes.
Of course, sometimes, for example, in the Neolithic, probably marital ties.
Yes, that's the families that.
Yeah.
So we have mixed families.
Yeah, exactly.
We have really one. It's not only one person that moved from Greece. It's a community, and they're mixed. And then after 100 years, one century, they were all mixed communities, melting pot.
Yeah, exactly.
But we noticed two traditions, both indigenous one and the Greek together. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting.
Thank you.
And now for something completely different. It is not.
We stay in the same test.
Yes, but we are chronologically, we have to jump a bit. So I would like to invite Vesna Vikic, and she will talk about craft product imitation and social identity, pottery and politics in Belgrade from 15th to 18th century.
Thank you. In its recent past, particularly during the Middle Ages and early modern period, Belgrade underwent significant uphills due to frequent warfare. These shifts in administration invariably impacted demographics, social structures, and consequently cultural dynamics, including pottery production. The mentioned 3-century-long period was marked by 3 turning points. Handover of Serbian Belgrade to the Hungarians in 1427, then Ottoman conquest of the Hungarian Belgrade in 1521, and Austrian conquest of Ottoman Belgrade in 1770. For our analysis, we will primarily focus on pottery phenomena occurring after the first 2 upheavals, drawing from relevant data. The reference pottery assemblages were excavated from the lower town and the Danube suburb, a fortunate circumstance as these areas served as complementary units throughout the 15th to 18th centuries. Initially, the fortified settlement in the lower town, being the primary civilian settlement, was reserved for the elite, while the local inhabitants resided outside the fortress walls. Subsequently, during the Ottoman and Austrian administrations, the lower town accommodated the military exclusively, while the nearby suburb emerged as the city's commercial center. Also, focus will be on cooking pots, since they provide a rich and nuanced perspective on the pottery styles during different epochs.
Previous archaeological explorations conducted at the Belgrade fortress and part of the Dorčul district have yielded pottery that have been meticulously contextualized and accurately dated. Moreover, thorough analysis have been undertaken, delving into not just the archaeological but also the archaeometric aspects of the pottery. This comprehensive approach enables us to delve into various facets concerning the production and consumption of cooking pots. Considering that the results of the archaeometric investigations have been published in 2021, the emphasis today will be on social and cultural aspects of the material. During the late 13th and 14th centuries, Belgrade was officially under Serbian administration, but it was a period marked by turbulent conflicts between Serbia and Hungary, leading to economic stagnation and depopulation. In the pottery assemblage from this era, two main groups of vessels have been identified. While these groups share similarities in terms of technology, they exhibit differences in vessel shapes and decoration. These distinctions reflect underlying cultural and craft trends of the period. Group A exhibited the distinctive features of Serbian medieval pottery, reminiscent of style prevalent in the territory of Serbian despotate spanning the 14th and early decades of the 15th century. Group B presents a particularly intriguing case. It can be described as locally produced in the strictest sense, presumably originating from a singular workshop in Belgrade. The cooking pots within this group display characteristics akin to pottery found in settlements on both sides of the Danube River. Regrettably, the available sample size from the initial period is relatively small, limiting our ability to draw definitive conclusions and leaving much of the analysis speculative in nature. After the first turning point, the situation is somewhat different. A distinct community of practice can be seen in the pottery material soon after 1527. In this respect, Group A represents the typical cooking pots of the Central European tradition, which comes from southern Hungary. Group B is representative of new local ceramic style. It shows a mixed tradition due to the use of quartzite raw material and thick wheel on the one hand, and the integration of vessel forms and decoration from the previous period on the other hand, into a new production context. In other words, it implies a direct interaction between two social groups. Cooking pots of this kind occur in archaeological contexts around the mid-15th century, when the production was fully optimized. Following the second upheaval during the Ottoman period, there is evidence of a technological shift in the production of cooking pots, albeit not uniformly across all aspects. The most significant difference lies in the technological aspect, where various technological choices emerged. Of particular interest is the group of calcite tempered cooking pots. Unlike the preceding period, when calcite was sparingly added and primarily used in clay mixtures for baking pans and covers, its presence in cooking pots is noteworthy. However, archaeometric analysis revealed no consistent correlation between specific raw materials and distinct production sequences. Consequently, it was concluded that several workshops made similar-looking cooking pots. I will mention the third point very briefly. With the change of government in 1717, came new pottery of the Central European tradition, fully standardized and uniform. It was delivered to Belgrade. It was not produced here. The main consumers of the new pottery are stationed in the fortress. It is the Austrian army. While in the core of the settlement, the natives continue to mainly use the old style pottery. To conclude from our review, the production of cooking pots in Belgrade was based on the following: the use of local raw materials in a different way. Shifting modeling technique can be linked to the dominant community of practice. In the 15th century, the use of the kick wheel reflects a shared practice within Central European Hungarian community. However, during the 16th and the 17th centuries, the use of the hand-turning wheel can be linked to the local practices and preferences of potters working with clay containing large inclusions. The composition of the potter's clay, the shapes of the vessels, and the thickness of the vessel's walls have been adapted to different cooking techniques. For example, wide open and wide bottomed ones in Ottoman times were probably used for cooking rice or dishes with rice. And finally, decoration is simplified, but remains recognizable during the entire period under observation. Pottery production mirrored the shifts in political and social landscapes, seamlessly adjusting to prevailing societal norms and craft preferences, alongside unique dietary and culinary demands. This adaptive process gave rise to innovative vessel designs, reflecting a fusion of disparate pottery traditions. It can be said that the locally made Belgrade cooking pots imitates the style of the pottery of the epoch in a certain way. Related to that are the questions: who is imitating and for what purpose? The distribution map suggests that the primary consumers of these vessels are predominantly, but not exclusively, natives, indicating a demand for cooking pots reminiscent of those known for their quality. This demand extends to the decorative elements, which exhibit a notable continuity from the 14th to the late 17th century. Interestingly, with the exception of the Danube suburb, these cooking pots were unearthed in settlement context within the lower town. For instance, discoveries include specimens found within the palace of the Belgrade Metropolitan, dating back to the second half of the 15th century, as well as within the residence of an Ottoman merchant from the 17th century. While there is notable disruption in pottery production after 1427 and 1521, signifying a hiatus in the transmission of knowledge among Belgrade potters, there remains a consistent utilization of raw materials sourced from the nearby Avala mountain and its surrounding villages. This continuity underscores a deep understanding of local resources among artisans. Hence, despite the interruption in traditional practices, it is plausible that local potters still played a role in making cooking pots potentially